My name is Stanislaw Robert Liberto with AV Ultra, and in this lesson, we're going to be creating an animated map in Apple Motion that we can use as a generator in Final Cut Pro 10. In the example that we have here in lesson 26 end, you can see I've got a specific point that our camera is always going to be moving to. What's special about this, as opposed to just animating it, is no matter where I put this specific waypoint, that camera will always follow. If I go to the end of my animation, I'm just going to drag this out to the middle of Africa here. And if I go back to the beginning, move my camera back into position, and I go ahead and I play this back, you'll notice that it's always going to be right there. In fact, if I want to move this, I can just drag this anywhere I want, and notice that that camera is always going to be centered on my text. Maybe I don't necessarily want it exactly at this angle. Instead, what I can do is rotate this a little bit. If I wanted this to be more of a top-down, and I go ahead and I play this back, move my camera back into position, now it's going to be animating right there. There's lots of times that I may not necessarily need a map of the world, but maybe a state or a specific area. What I can do with this is create drop zones in here to effectively change my map and my backdrop. For example, I've got a little bit of a bikini bottom map, but I may also want to change this to a map of the Earth at night on a dark backdrop. And no matter what I put in there, it's always going to be animating the same exact way. By publishing this as a generator, we can create a series of simple controls that lets us animate this the same exact way, but without having to jump into motion every single time. So just like I was in motion before, I can go ahead and I can swap out any of these different items with whatever I choose. So there's my world map again, and I can change my drop zone scale. And if we wanted to highlight a specific area, we can pan that. And I can change out this background just like any other backdrop that we may have had. I'm in my lesson 26 end, and in this lesson, I have a series of different groups. We have our map and table in one group, and inside there, I have my map on the table, my table drop zone, and then something here called final frame plate. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. I also have my waypoint, and this is that location that I have being called out on my map. And inside there, I have a camera, a frame plate, some text, and a circle thing. That is my locator. Lastly, I have a group of just some assets that I've included in here. In my project, you can see I have a series of different items published. Our text rotation, so you can see that that is revolving around that locator, the text that we want to replace, and our drop zone scales and position data. Let's go ahead and get started with creating this animated map. I'm in my lesson 26 start, and in this lesson, all we have right now is a series of some different media that I've included with this lesson. All of these are Creative Commons, except maybe this map of Bikini Bottom, which I will not be including, but otherwise the rest of these are public domain images that I got from pexels.com and Wikipedia. I'm going to go ahead and close this map and wood for right now, and we're going to start with creating a new group, and I'm going to call this group table and map. And we're going to turn off this maps and wood. In this table and map, I have it as a 3D layer, and the first thing I'm going to do is add an object drop zone. And that will create a drop zone that is filling my screen. Let me just remove this guide that I had there. And this drop zone is going to act as our table. And right away, I'm going to go into my table, open up my inspector, click on my media tab, and I'm going to go ahead and just pick some of this darker wood, just so I have something in there. We'll go back to our layers, and we are going to create a rectangle. So I'm going to come down to my tools, and I'm going to hit the letter R for rectangle, or click on it here. I'm just going to create a rectangle. I'm not too concerned about the size, shape, and placement of it right now. Now that I have it, I'm going to go ahead and get it fairly center. This is where I might want to drag out my guides. If you don't have your guides, you can go to View, Rulers, Guides, and turn those on. And I'm just doing this so that way I can see where my center is nice and tidy. If I ever want to turn that off, I can just turn off my overlays. I'm going to leave them on for right now. The next thing I'm going to do is add another drop zone. And this drop zone is going to be our map. And just like before, I'm going to go ahead and add my media right to that. And in this case, right now, I'm going to go ahead and add a map of the lovely Wisconsin where I live. And I'm going to go back to my layers and my properties for that map. And we're going to scale down the property transformation of this map. And I'm going to place that right about here. You can see in my canvas, I've got a little bit of edging from that map. So if I go to my image and I scale this, you can see that my map isn't necessarily rectangular. It's being cut off a little bit. And that's okay. I'm going to go ahead and just scale this up. So we've gotten rid of that. Now I'm going to go to my properties and we're going to add a little bit of a drop shadow. So I'm in my map, drop shadow, and I'm going to boost up that opacity to about 85% and a little bit of a blur and just a little bit more distance. I'm going to do the same thing for my rectangle. I'm going to add a drop shadow to that rectangle. I'm going to boost that up to about 95, blur it out about 8, and leave that as is. And the reason for that is if I zoom in and move across here, it's just giving me a little separation so I can create a little bit of depth in this item. And we're going to zoom this back out. So I'm going to pick my rectangle and we're going to edit that rectangle, and I'm just going to scoot that in a little bit to give a little bit more balance to my frame. So now I've got this map on a background on a table. That looks great. I'm going to go ahead and close this group and we're going to turn this off right now. The next thing I'm going to do is add a new group and we're going to call this group waypoint. And in this waypoint, we're going to create a circle. In the center of my canvas, I'm going to hold on to Shift Alt Option and drag out a circle. When I hold down Shift Alt Option, it's going to make a perfect circle from that center as I drag. And I'm just going to drag that down a little bit here so it fits on my canvas a little bit better. And I'm going to change that anchor point towards that center area. And what I'm going to do with this item is I want this to animate on. So just like in my example, you can see that I have that circle kind of expanding and revealing there. And that's what we're going to create right now. You'll notice that I was in my timeline and I wasn't at the very beginning, and that's okay. I'm just going to hit Command A, select everything, go to the beginning of my timeline in my project and hit I, and that'll trim the in point for all those items to the very beginning. And I'm going to go to about 20 frames. And I'm going to select my circle and we're going to scale this down to 0% and make a keyframe. And I'm going to go to about 1 second and 20 frames. So that way it's animating over the course of a second. We're going to change that to 100%. So between this point and that point, it's animating to 100%. The next thing I'm going to do is to get that inner circle animating, I'm going to go into my shape and we're going to turn off our fill and turn on our outline. And you can see my outline that's really thin. I'm going to boost this up. See something about that. It's okay that we're hanging off of our canvas right now because we're going to be working with that later. That's not really a concern of mine right now. I just want to see how thick I want to make this width. And so maybe something like that's going to look good. And I'm going to create a keyframe right here. I'm going to move back towards the beginning and you can see I still have that inner circle. And we're going to bump up this width till it's pretty much filled in. As it animates, you can see it's expanding. And now that circle from the inside expands out. So if I play this back, let's turn off these overlays. And that's happening just a little quick. So I'm going to go into my keyframe editor. I'm going to select those keyframes. And I don't necessarily have that right now, but I'm going to go to my width. I'm going to use my little drop down next to my keyframe. I'm going to say show in keyframe editor. I'm going to select these keyframes, right click, and change it to a Bezier. So now as this animates, it should be a bit smoother. In fact, we can finesse this just a bit more. And that's looking good to me. I'm going to do the same thing with the scale. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take these two items and put them down, so to speak. We can turn on this table and map. And what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this -90 degrees. And what that will do is if I'm rotating this -90, I'm moving it pretty much flat across. So it's as if it's an actual table and there would be legs here. We don't care about those legs because we don't need them. And I'm going to go to my waypoint. I'm going to go to my circle and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and move it to -90. The next thing I'm going to do is we're going to add a camera. So I'm going to go to my add object, camera. And this is very important. I'm going to put this in my waypoint group and we're going to change the camera settings. Come over to our camera and our camera properties, and I'm going to change this from framing to viewpoint. I'm also going to change the angle of view from 45 to about 54. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate this camera using my camera controls and line up where I want this to be. In my renderer, I'm going to change this to half. I'm going to turn off my depth of field, and I'm going to leave this as normal, and that should speed things up quite a bit. You can't necessarily see my circle right now, even though that my waypoint is at XYZ 0 and my map and table are at XYZ 0. If I click on my circle, I can see that my X and Y are just a little off, and I'm going to change this Y to 5 pixels. And now that is sitting on top of my map. So if I change my view to a perspective, and we'll zoom this out just a little bit. Before it was actually underneath my map, and now that it's at 5 pixels above, it's going to be sitting on top. Now that's a very, very large circle, and that's not necessarily what I want. I'm going to go to my waypoint, and we're going to scale this whole waypoint down. And you'll notice what's happening is that camera is traveling along with it because that camera is part of the waypoint group. And that's what we want. We don't want that separate for right now. However, when I come back to my active camera, you can see that it's really zoomed in because it's still following how big that was. And that's okay. We're going to zoom that back out to right about here. And I can see I've got a little bit of an issue on top right now. My drop zone for my table is just a little too small. I can see the background of that grid. And that's fine. I'm just going to go to my table and we're going to scale up the property of that table. So now that it is a much larger table. Notice I didn't go into the image scale. I went into the properties to make that a little bit bigger. And let's make that a nice round number of 140%. Now that we have our waypoint on our map, what we want to do is we want to animate this across time. We're going to click on our camera. We're going to add a couple behaviors. The first behavior we're going to add is go into our library, behaviors, or we can go up to here and click on behaviors, camera, and we want to choose a framing behavior. And you'll notice that it takes up the entire timeline. Not what we want. We want it to happen as this is kind of animating on. So I'm going to click I, since I have my framing selected, and we'll go to about here and hit O. And what framing will do is it will take a specific target and keep that in its frame. If I choose this circle and drag that in here, it is now, it is framed out to that circle. And I can change this offset to really zoom in. So no matter where I move this circle now, it is always going to be linked up directly to that. You can see in my corner in my perspective, as I'm moving this circle, the camera is moving right along with it to keep it dead centered. So if I was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, here's where it starts. And now my camera is going to move right there. What if I wanted this to be rotated as it was animating on there? I'm kind of limited because that circle is flat. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to create something else for it to frame onto. And this is a little trick that I've come up with, but something that I do in After Effects all the time is use something called a null object. It's basically an invisible object that we want to use as some other offset point. In my situation here, I'm going to go back to my waypoint and we're going to add another object. We're going to go to generators and we're going to add a color solid. And that color solid is going to be directly in the same center of our circle because everything is at the 0 point. And what we're going to do with this color solid is I'm going to take him and we're just going to move him up in the Y axis a little bit. And we can make him quite a bit smaller. He doesn't need to be that big. And I'm going to name this guy frame plate. And now that I have this framing behavior, I'm going to drag this frame plate into that framing behavior. And just like before, we're looking directly straight on at it. And that's great. So I can go ahead and change my framing offset to really zoom in to about here. Now this is where the magic happens. So if I take this frame plate and I can even turn him off, we don't necessarily need him on. We're just using him to line up our camera. Our camera is always going to be pointing directly at this face. Now that I have that information, I can change this and I can rotate this. So what's happening is I'm rotating this plate to give me a specific framing. So if I always want my locator to be kind of on the left side, if I move my camera to my perspective, we can kind of see this a little bit better. There's my frame plate. And notice that it's tilted, separated from my circle. Before, when we had just the circle, the camera was straight on it. But now if I move this frame plate and I rotate this, check out what's happening. It's always going to be focusing on that. So this is really powerful because I can use this to line up my shots separate than trying to animate something by hand. And if there's changes, I can quickly make those changes. I'm going to turn off this frame plate. We're going to go back into our active camera. Now that I have that lined up fairly well, I'm going to go back into my framing behavior and we're going to adjust this a little bit more. I want this to be a little bit lower and I want this to be zoomed in a little bit more. Go back to my frame plate and just rotate this a little bit. And now if I play this back, there it is zooming in and going right to that point. In my framing behavior, I want to adjust this a little bit more. We're going to change this position transition time to about 85. Same with this rotation. I'm going to change this to about 90. And we're going to change this transition to ease both. And I'm going to open up this path offset. If I play this back, you can see as it's moving, we're still seeing that edge as it's rotating in. And I don't want that. I want to go to about the halfway point. And by changing this path offset, what I'm saying is, hey, I'm adjusting that movement of that camera. We can see this a little bit better in my perspective view. And if I zoom this out, I can kind of move this down a little bit to make sure that the edge of my table is covered. So here is what I just created. You can see as it's moving in. And if I change this offset, like say back to up here, it's creating a different kind of movement. So by using these path offsets and this framing plate, I have ultimate control over exactly how I want my camera to animate across time. If I want this to take up a little bit more time, if this was keyframes, I'd have 8 or 9 different keyframes I'd be struggling with to line up properly. But with a behavior like this framing, I can just drag this out and adjust the amount of time it takes. That locator's looking pretty good. I like the way that that's animating on. I like that movement that's happening. The next thing I want to happen is I want to add some text showing what this place is. In my case, this is Marshfield, Wisconsin. I'm going to click on my text and I'm going to add some text that just says Marshfield, Wisconsin. A little hard to see because it's pretty small. I'm also going to drag that out to the beginning of my timeline. And it's sitting pretty close to where I want. A little hard to see, so I'm going to adjust the appearance. I'm going to make this dark text for our purposes for right now. And it's a little fuzzy because I have my renderer set to normal. If I change this to best, you'll see there it is. And the most important thing is I want to make sure that I have my rotation set up right. Because I've clicked on it from here, it's showing me flat on. That's compensating for the waypoint position. So I'm going to zero this out. And now that is flat inside this waypoint. So if I zoom this out, you can see that it's not quite lined up. And I can tell that my Z position is at 10,000, my Y position is at 400. So if I make that 0, now that is flat on the map. In fact, it's going just a little bit underneath it here. If you remember, we made our circle 5 pixels above. And if I adjust my Z, that's going to move it back and forth. And my X is going to move it left and right. I can always do some fine tuning by scaling things proportionately. So in my case, I'm going to take my Marshfield and we're actually going to make this quite a bit bigger. I'm going to go to my format and we're going to make that pretty large. The next thing I'm going to do is I want to be able to rotate this so that way it's always around that circle point. And if I rotate this now, it's only going to be rotating from that left edge. And that's not what I want. So I'm going to take my anchor point tool, make sure I have my overlays on, and we're going to drag this towards the center of that circle. So I'm using that circle as the place it rotates from. Now, if I rotate this, you'll notice that it is perfectly going around just that circle because that's the point of which it's going to be rotating on. I'm going to go ahead and just finesse this a little bit now. I've got my locator, I've got my text. Can't necessarily read all my text, so I can either resize my text or change my framing a little bit here. So I'm going to just zoom this out a little bit using my framing offset. And if I want to change the scale of this circle, notice I have my keyframes on there, and that's okay because I can just right click this and make it a new group. And now that group has its own scale properties. So I can scale this down and continually work with this. So if I wanted to move this over a little closer, we'll scale this. And because my anchor point is centered in the middle of that circle, that's going to work out great. To get a little animation on this Marshfield text, I'm going to go to my behaviors. We'll go to text basic and we're going to rotate in. And what rotate in will do is it'll rotate each one of our letters in across time. And I'm just going to scoot that over to here. I don't want my text on screen before it starts that behavior, so I'm going to select my text, click I, and that's moving a little slow for me, so I'm going to trim that down, go in my inspector for my rotate in, and in my controls, I want it to go from word. So now it'll rotate just Marshfield, Wisconsin. And we can change that spread to like 1, and so now that's going to do that whole word, and then Marshfield, Wisconsin. While I'm happy with this right now, I kind of want a secondary movement to happen in this space. So it's great that it's kind of moving in here, but it'd be great to get a little bit of more subtle movement across as it's moving on here. Let's choose our camera again, and we're going to go to our behaviors and add another camera movement, and we're going to pick sweep. And right away, you can see we have our sweep behavior. I'm going to trim that down to right when our framing finishes up. Go to about the 3-second mark and hit O to stop our sweep. So as that's moving, you can see that's moving across. I don't want it in that direction. We're actually going to take it to about a -10. And I'm going to change this from constant to an ease both. And we could probably pull that sweep back just a little bit more. And maybe that's still a little too much. So let's change this to a -6. And we'll let it sit there for a little while. Maybe we'll drag out our build out point, which I've built for us already, to the 9-second mark. And to wrap this up, I want this to animate back to this kind of position again. So just like before, when we had our framing come onto here, I could create another series of keyframes to animate this back. Otherwise, I'm just going to create another framing plate to end up here. So we'll go to our waypoint, and I'm going to collapse this and go back into our table and map. I'm going to add another object, generators, color solid, and I'm going to call this one final frame plate. And we're going to go ahead and scale this down a little bit. And there it is, sitting perfectly where we have our other map. And I'm just going to rotate this so it's facing us a little bit. And now if I go back to my waypoint camera, we're going to add one more behavior, framing, camera, framing. And we're going to add this one at the 9-second mark. And we'll take our final frame plate. And for our purposes, let's go into our generator and change the color just so we can tell it apart. And I'm going to drag that right into my framing 1. And we'll call this framing 1 final framing. So there it is animating, and then it's going to animate back to this position. And from here, I can turn off that final frame plate, and we're going to just change this offset a little bit more. So we're going to zoom this back out to something like this. We're going to change that transition to an ease both. And if I want to, I can take my first frame and my last frame and kind of work with that to match it up a little bit more. And I can always come back to my final frame plate and just rotate this. So maybe I want this to be flat on so I can kind of get a whole overhead view. Now that we have our animation complete, there's a few things that I want to publish and set up before I send this over to Final Cut. By default, our drop zones are going to be published, so we can leave those as is. Things that I'll definitely want to publish is my final frame plate, and I might want to publish its position and rotation. And I'm going to want to do that for my first frame plate. We're going to publish its position and rotation. And I'm going to go into my camera for its framing behavior. And that's what I have down here. And I'm likely going to want to publish its framing offset, its path offset. And I'll do the same thing with the final framing. We're going to publish its framing offset, its path offset. I'm going to go to my camera by itself and also publish its position and rotation. Even though that it's being controlled by framing, the reason why I'm publishing the position and the rotation is maybe I want it to start differently at the very beginning. If I wanted it from a top down, the only way I'm going to be able to do that is if I actually publish these from the get-go, because it won't start animating into that framing behavior until that behavior starts here. So I'm going to undo that change right now. If I click on my project and go to my project settings, I can see everything that I have published. You'll notice that I have a build in and build out, and those are these points that I've created here. I've mentioned these before in our title templates as far as setting up a build in and build out. And in the future, we're going to be taking a deep dive on exactly what these do, along with creating looping generators in the future. Be sure to come back and check out that lesson if you have questions on it. We have our source media, and that is our table. And then we have our map. I'm going to leave those for right where they are right now. And typically when I am publishing parameters, I'll publish one and go back right away. Now I remember what these were. These were our final frame plates. So this was my final frame position, final frame rotation. But if I didn't know what those were, I can always go back, right click, and reveal the original parameter. And that's going to tell me, oh, hey, this was the rotation for the final frame plate. That's why typically I'll go back, and as soon as I publish something, I'll jump into my project and rename it because I might be choosing lots of different things. We're going to change our other position to our framing position, framing rotation. And I'm going to actually drag both of those up above the final framing because that makes more sense. And I'm going to do the same thing with this framing and path offset. I'm going to say framing 1 offset, framing 1 path offset, final frame position, final frame rotation, final framing offset, final framing path offset, and then start cam position, start cam rotation. The last things I may want to publish is the color of this locator and the waypoint position itself. And the reason for that is if I want to change where this waypoint is going to start, I'm going to need that control. If I click on position, we're going to publish the waypoint. And I'm also going to go into circle group under the shape and publish the color of that shape. And in my text, we're going to go to our text and publish that as well. So if I go back into my project, my inspector, we're going to call this waypoint position, locator color, locator text. So if I change this, now I can easily change that, and I can change this to whatever text I'd like, and it's always going to be animating that same way. One thing to note with moving this waypoint, right? We've talked about this, and maybe as it's kind of framed up, I want it to be moved, down here and over here to Milwaukee. If I go back to the beginning of my timeline, notice that it's off just a little bit. And the reason for that is because my camera is part of that waypoint position. So I've moved this because it's inside of there. This is another reason why we're going to want to have that original camera position published. So I can always just come back to the very beginning and move it around wherever I'd like. Now that I have this complete and it's animating the way I want, I'm going to publish it out to Final Cut just to do some final testing. I'm going to go to convert this project to a generator, and I'm going to hit Save As. And it's going to ask me what I want to save this as, and I'm going to call this Lesson 26 Demo Complete. And it's going to ask me which category and theme to put this in. I'm putting in my testers. I'm putting in the theme of my AV Ultra. And I can choose whether or not I want to save a preview movie. I typically don't save preview movies only because it tends to take up extra space. And now that it says Lesson 26 Demo Complete, inside Final Cut, I'll go to that same category and theme, and there's my Lesson 26 Complete. I'm going to drag that into my timeline, and now I can see that that's animating exactly the way I wanted it before. Because I created that build in and build out marker, it's going to animate back and forth. If I stretch this out, it's still going to take that same 2 seconds or so to animate and use that sweep, but now it'll stay there until it reaches the end last second and then animate out very quickly. If I wanted to change any of this path offset now, so for example, I'm in this Wisconsin, I can change this framing position. I can open up my rotation and change this rotation. I can open up my text layer, and everything else will animate the same exact way. The last thing I can do is I can change my waypoint position, as we talked about before, and in this case, Madison. And if I go back to the beginning, change my start cam position to line things up the way I want. So that's a quick way to create an animated map locator in Apple Motion. Now that you know how to build something like that out, I have a series of generators that I'll be releasing as part of a travel pack that moves from location to location and animates these little flags. In this example, in my waypoints here, you can see I have lots of different kinds of flags that we can choose from and even change into our specific drop zone. So if you had a specific flag you wanted to place in here, you can do that and they'll all animate. So if this is something that you're going to be looking for your different projects and don't feel like building them out from scratch, be sure to check this out. This will be for sale on my website. And again, my name is Stanislaw Robert Liberta. Hopefully you found this information useful. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.